First of all, I want to thank everybody for the chance to be here today. I'm excited to be at this conference this weekend. There's some great papers I'm looking forward to hearing later. I also want to take a quick moment to thank my wife, Angel. She's here today, and she helped with the screen capture, the game screen. So any videos that you'll see, I'm going to move this down just a little, were captured by either myself or my wife. So she was a big part of getting this ready. I would say, go here and video this, and she did it for me. It's great. So with no further ado, the music of the Legend of Zelda series is a perennial topic in video game music scholarship. The newest installment of the franchise, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, has a significantly different musical palette than earlier games, prompting discussions in the gaming world with varied titles ranging from, does Breath of the Wild have memorable music? To the genius behind Breath of the Wild's music, and more recently, in defense of Zelda Breath of the Wild's soundtrack. Whether gamers like or loathe the sounds of Breath of the Wild, it's clear that the music stands out from other games in the franchise. Jason Brame, Elizabeth Medina-Gray, and Steven Reale have explored various aspects of the series, including thematic unity, spatial transformational relationships, and modular combinations. Today, I suggest a slightly different set of relationships for Breath of the Wild's music. Drawing on work by Robert Hatten and Byron Almén, I propose that the music of Breath of the Wild is situated around topical functions, stylistic idioms, and neo-narrative organization. The game consistently contrasts the modernist past with a pastoral present. Modernist idioms with weak or non-existent tonal centers feature prominently around objects of the distant past, while more standard tonal or modal themes appear around living communities. This organization helps players develop a personalized neo-narrative arcs within a broad open-world game. The musical departure showcases an evolution in both narrative gameplay and the interaction between music, environment, and gamer. Within Breath of the Wild, various musical contexts, which I group into topics, help define a robust narrative organization. Robert Hatten has defined musical topics as patches of music that trigger clear associations with styles, genres, and expressive meanings. I divide Breath of the Wild's music into two broad topical categories, modernist and pastoral. My usage of these terms is somewhat unique to this context. I consider the modernist category to consist of any idioms that invoke a modern, postmodern, ultramodern, or minimalistic aesthetic. To disentangle these stylistic subgroups would be a worthwhile project of its own, but would unnecessarily complicate today's discussion. Defining features include obscure or absent melodic content, synthetic and mechanical timbres, emphasis on dissonances, and pointillistic textures. A category of pastoral topics contrasts with this modernist topic. The pastoral topic has been discussed extensively by Hatten and others. For my purposes, this is an inclusive category of classic and folk styles. Elements that fall into this aesthetic include clear, memorable thematic content, clear pitch centricity, primarily acoustic instrumentation, and an emphasis on consonance and simplicity. In addition to serving as musical topics, I propose that the modernist pastoral aesthetics are key elements within the game's narrative structure. I have previously defined narrative as something that is capable of referring to external objects or events, even imaginary or abstract ones, projects a temporal structure, and uses consistent patterns or archetypes. Further, neo-narrative is the idea of being, in Michael Klein's words, in search of new ways of telling stories. Both the organization of the gameplay and the music style suggest a new mode of storytelling within the franchise. In Breath of the Wild, the distinction between story and discourse is particularly relevant. In her 2001 article, Vera Mixnick summarizes that story is the content, or the narrated events abstracted from their disposition in the text and reconstructed in their chronological order, while the discourse is the means or the signifier by which the content is communicated in the actual text, that is, the mode of the unfolding of events. The story of Breath of the Wild is fairly straightforward. The discourse, however, is much more complex. Players only learn the details of Ganon's victory if they choose to track down a series of memories, which are pieced together as they are discovered, most likely not in chronological order. Players also have a multitude of options for building a unique discourse while completing the content of the main story. Music associated with certain locations, characters, and creatures helps to situate players within both the large story and smaller narrative side quests. The unique approach to discourse makes Breath of the Wild a progressive step in a narrative gameplay. Now I'd like to turn to a small sampling of some specific musical elements from Breath of the Wild to demonstrate some of the interactions between the game's music and its narrative structure. First, I will consider the music encountered in shrines. In the game, the player discovers that shrines are relics from the distant past that remain as training grounds for the hero. Shrines are miniature dungeons and contain a variety of mechanized puzzles, mazes, and guardians. Likewise, the music of shrines showcases the modernist musical aesthetic and is identical in all 120 shrines, regardless of where the entrance is found or what the specific task is. Like Schoenberg's 12 tones related only to one another, the shrines are given essentially equal importance in Breath of the Wild. That doesn't mean necessarily equal difficulty, but anyway. Upon entering a shrine, texture and timbre are in the musical foreground. Rather than opening with a catchy theme or a motive, shrines begin with a single chime pitch that is followed by reverberating electronic overtones, invoking a modernist topic through its distinctive timbre and lack of clear melodic content. The chimes and reverberations are each allowed to dissipate before the next begins, creating a spacious texture. This aesthetic creates a sense of separation from the rest of Hyrule. When inside a shrine, Link is cut off from both the sights and sounds of the world above. Let's hear the opening of... There we go. Please excuse the bokoblin arm. Right, so that is entering the shrine. That's the first thing you hear in any shrine in the game. While dissonance is not emphasized in the shrine music, texture and timbre are reminiscent of certain 20th century styles, such as Morton Feldman's. Melodic content does eventually appear, first in a bass melody and later in a more traditional melody played by a bagpipe. Here is a clip with, you'll hear the bass kind of underneath things, and then the bagpipe melody will come in after a few seconds. When the bagpipe melody enters, it acts as a foil to the prevailing style of stasis, much like the viola melody near the end of Morton Feldman's Rothko Chapel. For those of you who might not be familiar with that, here's a clip of just a few seconds of that, starting with some just kind of stasis. So that kind of works in a similar manner. In-game, the bagpipe melody is surprisingly easy to miss, is overridden by any action-specific sound effects or themes, such as a puzzle completion, treasure chest, or approaching a guardian. After these interruptions, the opening chime and reverberations always return and are the central feature of the shrine music. Rather than signaling a specific location or event within the game, such as a particular boss, a particular temple, or overworld location, the music in Shrine signifies a generic, repetitive plot point. The hero faces a challenge in order to strengthen himself. This important step, repeated up to 120 times, not including the new DLC, infuses the journey within Breath of the Wild with mythic weight, while simultaneously freeing the player to craft a unique sequence of events. The journey of my Link will not be the same journey as your Link. Victoria Adaminko describes appearance of an archetype within a story as part of the definition of myth. She writes, "Myth seems to be collecting variants of the same idea or archetype, even within one story. This archetype reveals itself through its multifarious appearance. While the archetype itself, the hero's trials or gaining strength to face Ganon, is nothing new to the series, the unfolding of this archetype is different in Breath of the Wild." Shrines, of course, are not the only elements of the distant past that invoke the modernist topic. The player has the option to work through 4 larger dungeons known as the Divine Beasts. Unlike the shrines, the musical context of the Divine Beasts differs among the 4 dungeons. For today's discussion, I will look only briefly at Vamedo, the bird Divine Beast associated with the Rito champion Revali. Upon arrival, this dungeon presents the player with a distinctly modernist soundscape, including dissonant chords and electronic accompaniment. Compare those chords to the opening of Schoenberg's famous Opus 33A. These chords the first chords that we heard, follow a player through the first part of the dungeon until, as the presence of Ganon is removed, the sounds change to a quasi-minimalist scalar string motive. Each of the other divine beasts have a similar mixture of synthetic, piano, and other acoustic instruments, creating unique but interconnected musical contexts. The shifting among various styles within the modernist topic usually posit a continuum, in which dissonance is linked with Ganon's control, while other modernist idioms such as minimalism or electronic timbre are associated with benevolent or more neutral challenges. Like the shrines, the 4 divine beasts may be completed in any order or omitted entirely before facing Ganon entering Princess Zelda. However, unlike shrines, the divine beasts each have their own narrative subplot in which Link recovers memories of the 4 champions associated with the beasts. Beyond this, Link gains a unique ability after defeating each beast, which have an impact on subsequent gameplay. Thus, the narrative effect of the divine beasts is more potent than that of the shrines, just as their music is more diverse. Unlike earlier games, though, none of the powers are prerequisite for any of the others, again allowing complete freedom in the development of a player's particular discourse. In contrast to the modernist aesthetic, locations that are inhabited exhibit music I associate with the pastoral topic. Each set of locations, or one such set of locations, is the network of stables. Like shrines, stables are scattered throughout Hyrule, are similar to one another in appearance, and use essentially the same musical materials regardless of location. However, the tranquil acoustic ambiance of the stables is a stark contrast to the modern aesthetics previously discussed. As seen here, the player will often hear the stable before seeing it, whereas shrine music only occurs within the confines of the shrine. This separation highlights an important distinction in narrative function. Shrines are elements of the distant past, separated from the day-to-day life of Hyrule's residents, while the stables make up a part of the landscape and are populated by the living. Furthermore, while shrines function to unfold a mythic archetype through repetition, stables serve to lengthen a player's discourse through the addition of side quests. Just as the divine beasts exhibit location-specific musical content within the modernist topic, certain locations feature specific pastoral music. Kakariko Village is one of those locations and is central to the plot of both Breath of the Wild and other Legend of Zelda games. As you see here, the pastoral is evoked visually through buildings of wood and with an emphasis on agriculture as a main activity for the villagers. Like the stables, Kakariko Village is the launch point for several completely optional side quests. However, it's also the home of Impa, a recurring character from the series who, in this iteration, provides wisdom and guidance for Link's journey. Impa is also the point of contact for the quests associated with the Divine Beasts, Link's lost memories, and the main quest to defeat Ganon. Kakariko's music features only acoustic instruments with a clear, repetitive melody. The living nature of Kakariko Village is further emphasized with a temporal marker. We just heard the daytime version of the theme, but there's also a slower, darker version for night. We'll play just a small snippet of that. While initial events of the game push the player towards traveling to Kakariko Village, the timeline and the route are all open. Players may explore extensively before venturing to the village, so providing musical markers that differ depending on arrival time enhances the unique nature of each individual's experience of Breath of the Wild. It is also conceivable that a player could choose to complete the primary narrative without ever visiting Kakariko Village, creating yet another narrative with fewer modules than one that incorporates the quests suggested by Impa. Imagine facing Ganon in the Ocarina of Time without ever speaking to Sheik or consulting Navi. While the majority of the Breath of the Wild keeps a clear tension between modernist and pastoral topics, there are several events that blur or even ignore these lines, suggesting the possibility for a more detailed taxonomy of topic, trope, and function within the game. One example that blurs this line between aesthetics is tied closely to Link and his actions. When Link is riding a horse, an open pointillistic piano begins as the accompaniment. However, familiar melodic content from other games in the series appears if you continue to ride undisturbed, an augmented Zelda's Lullaby in the daytime and the Hyrule Field theme at night. We'll listen to both of those as well. I interpret the troping of the modernist topic, the pointillistic piano, against the familiar pastoral themes as a subtle yet clear commentary on Link's role as Hyrule's champion, interacting with the mechanized past while working to save the living Hyrule. One other particularly noteworthy example is generic, like shrines or stables, but doesn't fit within either aesthetic. The Great Fairy Fountains have a transcendent theme that is familiar to fans of the series and appears virtually unaltered from other entries in the series. Compare excerpts from several console games. First, Ocarina of Time. Majora's Mask. The Wind Waker. Twilight Princess. After a lengthy introduction, Skyward Sword. And finally, Breath of the Wild. As you may have noticed, in each case, the fairy's theme prominently features harp, with a melodic contour filled with descending prolongations. It seems that the great fairies exist somehow outside of the narrative time of the various games. They are ahistorical creatures who appear to help Link, but are unaffected by events of Hyrule. The preservation of the fairy's theme ties Breath of the Wild to the other games in a strong yet subtle way. However, like the vast majority of the game's music, the tie is only initiated if the player chooses to visit or stumbles upon one of the fountains and frees the fairy. This again allows for the possibility of a unique Zelda experience without great fairies, should a player choose to omit those events from their narrative discourse. These, of course, are just a minuscule samplings of the various musical elements within the world of Breath of the Wild. However, I hope that this presentation has pointed out some of the stylistic contrasts that help create the unique storytelling experience in this game. As Link battles with forces controlled by Calamity Ganon, his struggle is highlighted by a contrast between the modernist and pastoral topics musical topics that surround him. Thank you. And hopefully we've got time for a couple questions.
Thank you very much. We do have, in fact, just a few minutes for questions, and the cube is here, so feel free to pass it around. Just be careful, please.
Hello. So thank you for this fascinating talk, and thank you also for no spoilers. I'm still working on the game. So I was not aware of the intertext between, when you're riding the horse, between the Hyrule theme and the Zelda theme, and so thank you for pointing that out. But one that I was aware of is that in the stable theme, that content is based on Epana's theme from Ocarina of Time.
Yes.
So I don't know. I guess the question is, because I'm actually speaking later on intertextuality as well, and so are horses in Breath of the Wild just kind of this intertextual kind of locus of just bringing together these different themes? There seems to be a thing with horses.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really great question. I actually had to cut this little caveat that I made in my first draft of this paper, where I said intertext is not a huge part of my talk today, and that's part of why, because it's a huge topic in this, and I think that's there were so many different roads I could have gone down and things I could have explored. I think that's a really great idea. Thinking about horses in general as maybe a point of intertext in the game would be really interesting to look into. So I think yes would be kind of the short answer to your question.
My comment was going to be also a Epona song, but one that doesn't have to do with horses, and this was the one that made me like drop my controller, because it was Death Mountain, the piano music at the top of Death Mountain, which is, I don't believe you've heard that theme since the very first Zelda. I might be wrong, but it was the music from the inside of Death Mountain in Zelda 1, 1986. And so I think about the importance of intertext being from the standpoint of fan service. Mm-hmm. You know, many people playing the Zelda games at this point in time have not actually played that original Zelda, and that moment was a love letter to me, and I felt it was a love letter to me. So right. It was a very, very moving moment.
Yeah, that's the other reason why I didn't do a lot of intertext, because I consider myself a casual fan. I haven't played a lot of the earlier games, so thank you for that too.
Thank you so much. I have two things. One is that speaking of intertext in previous games, one of my grad students this semester is working on compiling a full Zelda thematic catalog.
Awesome.
So when that is available, I'll let you guys know. I'll tweet it out, so just watch for it. The second thing is, when you get into this notion of troping, which I know you just touched on a little bit, but I think is a really rich way of engaging with music. I'm going to talk about it later this afternoon. I found David Neumeyer's approach to tropes to be very fruitful. Okay. He sees topics and tropes along a continuum, so there's not an either or, but there's sort of a middle ground that that's really, really useful to kind of play around.
I'll look into that a little bit more. David Neumeyer.
So check that out. I'll talk about it this afternoon as well, but this is a great talk. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Will. Thanks for this. It was fantastic. I really like the dichotomy you've set up between the pastoral and the modern. And I heard something here that, in the context of playing, I was too engaged with finishing the dungeon to hear on my playthrough. The Va Meadow dungeon music, the bird dungeon, features this floaty string ascending progression for a moment before going back to the more shrine-like modernism, if you will. That floaty melody, for lack of a better way to describe it right now, is also the same type of stuff used to intro the Rito Village theme, which is clearly pastoral and it's Dragon Roost Island, but that floaty introduction is the same in both the dungeon and the town. And I'm left wondering if there's similar dichotomies of the modern floaty song and the pastoral floaty song, for instance, in the Elephant Dungeon and Zora's Domain, because the town is clearly pastoral and the dungeon is clearly modernist. Right. Have you found similar points of musical connection that make the dungeon relate to the town?
I think that speaks to where I mentioned the continuum within the topic, where I've just kind of lumped kind of a lot of different things in this modernist ideal. But I think yes would be again, the short answer of that, yeah, there are, especially within the divine beasts, because you also have the kind of living champion spirits that are involved in that, without trying to say too terribly much again. But yeah, there are those living spirits, and I think some of those more kind of minimalistic, just sort of timbrally focused modernist idioms could definitely connect to some of those pastoral ideas through the fact that they're not Gannon, but they're elements of the past still, so there's still that other kind of topic. They're not this living pastoral right now sort of thing. But yeah, definitely I think those connections are certainly there. You could get a lot deeper into this. Like I said, I cut so much when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to talk about. There's so much I wanted to talk about, but yeah.
All right. Thank you.